Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. We're back for another deck tech today, and today we're going to go over one of my favorite modern decks. This is the Turbo Turns deck. This is I guess you could say, a combo slash control deck, which abuses infinite turns, or it's actually not quite infinite turns, but it's very, very consistent. As you can see, it is a mono blue deck, which is kind of odd. Mono blue decks are not that common in modern. But the mana base is pretty simple, and it's a very fun deck to play. If you love playing control and combo decks, this is a definite deck that you are going to love and probably have played if you haven't already. If you're new to Modern, this is actually a deck that's arguably fairly affordable. There are some cards that are kind of pricey, but aside from the turns and the, I guess you could say, the Howling Mine column here, most of the stuff is most of the deck is actually fairly customizable. Now, the idea of the deck is you want to spam constant extra turn effects, which you see on the bottom row, which I pointed out earlier. But there's actually several things you have to kind of know before you do that, and it's just a few key rules that you'll have to keep in mind whenever you play the deck. So, without further ado, let's dive into the deck and show you what everything does. I guess the first part of the deck I want to show is this part here. These cards might be kind of a motley crew of cards here, but they actually are all categorized here for a reason. This is, you could say, I guess you could kind of say, is the engine of the deck, or the core, arguably. These are the cards that we actually, oddly enough, need to win. And although this deck is very powerful, usually you will, technically speaking, win by turn 5, although it's actually not quite turn 5 because you take extra turns. These are the cards that get you where you want to go. The idea is, in order to generate all this advantage from our turns, we need to draw more than one card a turn. So all these cards here either give us extra cards or help us fix our draw in one shape or form or another. Starting at the top left, we have a full set of Dictative Crucifix. Originally, those used to be Howling Mines. Dictative Crucifix I actually like better than Howling Mine because it actually powers Devotion for Thassa here, and you can play it on the end of your opponent's turn, which is very flexible because you may not always want to play it on turn 3. You may want to play it turn 4 or 5 before you start taking extra turns. It's actually kind of a big accelerant, and although it's not ramp, it really gets us those extra cards that we do need. Beneath it, we have one of our very few win conditions. We have 2 copies of Jace Beleriand. Jace is just here kind of to fill the same role as the Dictative Prefix. Just gives us extra cards. It does give our opponent extra cards, but that's not always a terrible thing, considering if we do take all the turns in the world, our opponent is hopefully going to be tapped out or have very little mana to do stuff. So hopefully they won't have to really have that many options to respond once they do draw more cards. But like I say, this is one of our win conditions. It is how we win the game. You do want to ultimate this Jace. Is like the only deck I can really think of where it wins by ultimating a Jace Beleriand. Up at the top right, we have 1 copy of Kami of the Crescent Moon. This is kind of more of my personal preference putting it here. It does have some matchups that it isn't very good against, but I just like to have it to kind of mix up my opponent a little bit, because if I run everything that's an enchantment, then they'll obviously cite an enchantment removal for it, but I'll have a creature instead, which is hopefully what we want. The downside to Kami is it does die to a lightning bolt, which is really common, but it's basically another Howling Mine. If you don't want to run Kami, you can run a Howling Mine or something very similar in its place. I wouldn't recommend running something like Font of Mythos, just because that card's really bulky, and you don't want to have anything that's too bulky. That's one of your generators. You want to have the most efficient card advantage generators as possible. Beneath Kami, we have our 1 copy of Thassa, God of the Sea. This is, I guess you could say, our main win condition. Devotion's pretty easy to get, considering all of these other spells provide 2 blues, so essentially you just need 2 other of these permanents and Thassa and you're golden. And once you have Thassa, you usually have a 5/5 unblockable creature. Just the important thing about these cards is they're the key cards you need to win the game. It's really good if you actually get these cards out before you start taking turns. So, because if you just start taking turns without any of these cards, you'll just kind of fall on your face, and you really won't get that much advantage. And it's very, very unlikely that you will win the game. So once you have one of your card advantage batteries out, you want to start taking as many turns as you can, and each turn you take, you'll get a lot more cards than your opponent probably would. Because we run 13 copies of extra turn cards, it's very likely that we will draw one each turn, considering that we draw more than one card each turn. Starting at the top left, we have our full set of Time Warps. The reason it's there is pretty obvious. We want to take extra turns, and Time Warp is probably the most consistent and affordable extra turn effect we have in the format. Next to it, we have Walk the Aeons, which just costs one more, but if we're in a pinch, we can sacrifice 3 islands and buy it back, which means it will go back to our hand rather than into our graveyard. Just a wonderful card, great for pinches, like I say. You probably don't want to always buy it back, but I think it ultimately comes down to playtesting, and you'll know when you will need an extra turn. Moving on to the right, we have our full set of Temporal Mastery. I do run a full set in this. Hardcasted, this is a 7 mana spell, but if we draw it as the first card within a turn, we can cast it for 2 mana, which is incredibly efficient. If we miracle this for 2 mana, it's usually game over if we can play or have a card advantage battery out, just because it gives us so much advantage after that, and it basically gets the ball rolling. It might seem really expensive, but it actually really is worth it, and they are really, really good, even though they do exile themselves. Beneath here we have 2 one-ofs. We have our 1 copy of Temporal Trespass, which, like Temporal Mastery, also exiles itself, but we can also delve it. The main cost is 8 and 3 blues, but with Delve, we usually cast this usually between 4 and 6, sometimes for 3. It's very rare though, but usually it's between 4 and 6 is usually really good. And honestly, there's a lot of cards that will go into your graveyard that you probably will not need later. Next to it is our one of part the Water Veil. Some people like to run 2 of these rather than a Water Veil and a Trespass. I just like to run them just for variety, and there will be matchups where you face cards like Slaughter Games. To keep your opponent guessing, I like to run a variety. This is, technically speaking, one of our win conditions. We can use Awaken for 9 mana to take an extra turn and get a 6/6 from one of our lands. Next up we have our Cantrip package, which basically just has a bunch of support cards which give us more cards and fix our draws and help us out. Starting on the left we have Serum Visions, which is a really nice card, which helps us fix our draws in a combo deck. We do need our draws to be really good, and Serum Visions does just that. You can also use it in combination with Jace Bolera, and you can use it first before you pick up a card with Jace, which is really nice. Moving on to the right, we have our full set of remands. Since this is a combo control deck where we do try to win fairly quickly, although it doesn't seem quickly, it's usually on our turn 5 we start taking turns. Remand is awesome, considering although they will get the spell back, it usually won't matter just because we'll be taking all these turns. And more than likely, Remand will say that you won't be able to cast a spell for a really long time, much longer than just the 1 turn delay that it normally gives. And finally, we have 2 copies of Cryptic Command. I've seen decks run a few more copies, but 2 has been working out for me. Usually it's good not to run too many, just because it's a pretty heavy spell, and although it is really good at stopping alpha strikes and whatnot, it's just excellent. If you know you go up against a lot of decks that also run blue, you may not want to run too many of these just because it's a very heavy spell, and if it gets spell pierced or dispelled, it's really disheartening. Next up we have our plethora of, I guess you could say, 1 mana support cards. Starting on the left, we have our full set of Giga Drowse. Giga Drowse is a wonderful card, especially against other blue decks that run counterspells. A lot of people do run less of these. I've always run a full set, and the reason is just because blue is very popular at my meta, and I like to just use the replicate ability to tap all their blue sources so they can't counter my Time Warp that will cause me to get the ball rolling, so to speak. Also, it's nice to have some consistency, and having a full set of them is really, really good. Plus, it's a very versatile card. The replicate's really, really good. You can just use as much as you want to tap as much as you want. And it's just, oftentimes, it buys you a turn. If you don't have a Time Warp to continue your turn streak, you can use a Giga Drowse to kind of replace it. In some cases, it won't be as effective, but it's usually really, really good, considering if you take more turns, you're likely going to have more lands, and in turn, you will have enough blue mana to tap all your opponent's permanents. Going on to the right, we have our 2 copies of Spell Snare. Spell Snare, this is something that you can kind of customize if, depending on your meta, if you know there aren't that many decks that run problematic 2-drops, then this is a-okay. You can run something else. Maybe like other good options, maybe Telling Time. There are several different options, but I just run Spells and Arrow just because I know there are a lot of problematic 2-mana spells in the format. Thalia is really annoying. Gaddock is a pain in the butt. Scavenging Ooze will eat up your Time Warps. Rest in Peace will make it so your graveyard is non-existent. There's just a lot of really nasty 2-mana spells that are in the format. Finally, we have our one copy of Elixir of Immortality. We'd like to have a way to shuffle our graveyard into our library, and Elixir is the best way to do this. Gives us life. This deck is a mono blue deck, so life gain's kind of rare. It's nice to have it in there. But also it shuffles our graveyard back into our library, and therefore we can get all the turns that we used before back again. For our mana base, we have a total of 19 islands, one reliquary tower, considering we're going to be drawing a ton of cards from our card advantage sources. It's nice to have a reliquary tower so you don't have to discard them. We have Mikakoro, the center of the sea, which is kind of like a Howling Mine in some cases. It is a shame that you do have to pay the extra 2, but everyone gets a card when you activate it. So it's really nice. It kind of plays off the theme of the deck. And in a pinch, it can be used as an extra Howling Mine effect, although one thing I will say is sacrificing 2 mana, or 3 mana I guess you could say, a turn for an extra card is not always worth it, especially in the early game. But late game, when you have enough mana, this usually is a wonderful substitute. And finally, one copy of Fairy Conclave. It's really nice to have. It may not seem necessary, and I don't think it always is, depending on your meta, but it's nice to have. Sometimes you may not have your win cons, and it's nice to occasionally have a blocker or an attacker when you need it. Moving on to sideboard options, this here is not really the sideboard I'm using right now, but it is a lot of the cards I have used over the years. Starting off at the top left corner up here, we have Mindbreak Trap. I originally brought this in against things that couldn't be countered, like Slaughter Games, Emrakul, although they still get the extra turn. But nowadays, you may want to consider the new card Summary Dismissal from Eldritch Moon. It's probably a decent replacement for this. We have Shadow Doubt, good against anything that uses a tutor or something similar. Scape Shift, Quarter Calling, any deck that uses that, it's wonderful against. Laboratory Maniac comes in against decks that would potentially exile our graveyard, because we'll have to have some way to win that doesn't involve spamming extra turns too much, because we won't have any way to get them back. Moving on, we have one Leyline of Anticipation. This, along with Teferi and Boseiju, are also really good against the control matchups. The idea behind Leyline is you want to get it out early. It pays for Thassa's Devotion, but it also allows you to cast Time Warps on your opponent's turn, and therefore, if you cast it on your opponent's turn, they'll have to counter it on their turn, and then after they do that, you should be able to play one on your turn if they fell for the bait. Spell Guides were just really good against decks that rely on, I guess you could say, targeting effects, like auras. Poison is another option. You may want to, like I say, it's really up to your meta. Spreading Seas is good against multicolor decks and decks with pesky lands. These 4 cards here are just a bunch of counterspells I've used over the years. Dispel and Negate for annoying instants, counterspells, combo pieces, you name it. Disdainful Stroke was actually more popular last winter when Eldrazi were more of a thing, but it's just able to counter big spells. And Trick Bind, because some decks like to revolve around activated and triggered abilities. These 3 artifacts here are just mainly there based on your meta. You may not always need them, but it can be adjusted to your liking. Grafdigger's Cage, mainly for Reanimator and similar things. It's also actually pretty good against Quarter Calling. Torpor Orb, considering Collected Company is becoming more prevalent. Really good against things like Eternal Witness, Kitchen Finks, etc. Really great. And lastly, we have Pithing Needle, which kind of serves the same purpose as Trick Bind. It's just a bit more permanent, and it can be answered easier. And that is the deck. That is Turbo Turns. This deck is not only one of my favorite decks to play in Modern, but it's actually, I feel like it would be pretty relevant in the current meta, considering the meta seems to be leaning more towards mid-range and control decks. Its worst matchups are, of course, aggro decks and decks that just try to win as fast as possible just because it doesn't like pressure. Thank you all so much for watching. My name is Ryu Spectre, and I'll see you all next time.